Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. My name's Ian Coles and I'm the head of the global mining team at Mayer Brown. I'm joined by my colleague Tim Baines, who is in our environmental group in London. And Tim is going to talk to us about the growing importance of ESG in the mining industry, with a particular emphasis on environmental and sustainability and ESG principles overall. There will be a separate webinar concentrating on social and governance later on in this series. The webinar is part of a series we are hosting during July on Mining Insights, the Mayer Brown Perspective. Further details are available from our website.
Thanks very much, Ian. Hello, everyone. My name's Tim Baines, and I sit in the Environment and Planning team here at Mayer Brown in London. My involvement with ESG, environment, social and governance matters, goes back to one of the first United Nations Environment Programme reports on the integration of ESG into fiduciary decision-making and the introduction of the Equator Principles, and all that was back in the mid-2000s. And I think at that time we were really in the early foothills of ESG and defining what the concept of ESG meant and how it should be taken account of. It's really a fascinating area, and I think there's been a massive change since that time, and now we can really quite clearly define what ESG is, although it's a very broad area and will always be. So I think that represents a bit of a sea change over the last decade at least. So for many people, ESG is no longer about what ESG is or whether to do ESG, but how to do it or how well to do it. Interestingly, I think the ESG movement has really largely been driven by a sort of bottom-up push from investors, the investor community. And though lenders and corporates have played their role, in some cases it seems it seems really that the corporate community is in many ways playing catch up and trying to keep up with a lot of the demands that are being put on them by the investor community, which can be seen as sort of racing ahead in many instances. Although we'll see shortly that ESG in the mining sector in particular relies on a lot of mining community-led initiatives to integrate ESG into mining activities. So although there's been a lot of progress over the last decade or so, there'll be more. ESG is in many ways still a work in progress. ESG standards are constantly evolving, and so are businesses' responses to those standards. We'll touch upon some of the legislative initiatives that are starting to crop up, particularly in the EU in respect of ESG, which are really driving momentum in this area. One of the really interesting things about ESG is that there's no such thing as an ESG lawyer. I'm an environmental lawyer, but E, S and G cuts across a huge range of legal disciplines. Of course, E is crucially important, but in many ways it's the most traditional of the ESG elements. It's been around for a long time. The social side of ESG is also fundamental and arguably no more so than in the mining sector. And Ian and my colleagues Sam Eastwood and Audrey Harris will be presenting on the S in a later webinar as part of this series, which I hope you can join, and I'll try and confine my comments today to the E side of ESG and to a general introduction to ESG. Once I've done the sort of general view, we'll be touching on some of the mining-specific ESG initiatives and some of the ESG-related legislation that's cropping up, and perhaps touching on some of the differences that we're seeing between the EU's approach and that in the US. And then we'll touch on some examples of best practice in the area. I've set out a few quotes here, at least two of them are from the FT, which I think illustrate tensions that arise in the ESG area in the mining sector. On the environmental side, the world simply can't reach its carbon and energy objectives without products that can only be sourced by mining, so the rare earth metals, for example, that are mined and are fundamental to new technologies, be that smartphones and those kind of things, but also wind farms, the turbines and battery technology. So put simply, we have no option to stop mining. On the other hand, there are things that all organizations can do to improve environmental performance. There's a need now more than ever to manage business reputations and also to present things in an appropriate manner. I'm sure that Sam and Audrey will talk about supply chain management and various principles of stakeholder engagement and disclosure that are very relevant. But I don't think the mining industry is alone in having to balance all of these tensions. We see it also in the oil and gas sector, which is under significant ESG pressure at the moment, and also with regard to financial institutions, all of which are facing significant shareholder activism and increasing pressure on a wide variety of areas. I think overall we can describe it as the role of a company changing in some ways, so that the perception of a company as an entity for creating money is changing into the perception of a company as an entity that has a much broader role in terms of stakeholder engagement, and particularly larger companies are being asked to police various environmental, social initiatives. So before we dive into some of the mining-specific ESG initiatives, I thought it would be useful to go through some of the other drivers which all organizations, large organizations certainly are faced with nowadays. So in the middle there I've referred to the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, which are described as a call for action by all countries, both developed and developing, to work together in a sort of global partnership. They set out a number of key areas, key goals for to be reached by 2030, that go hand in hand with areas like health and education, reducing inequality, spurring economic growth, all at the same time as tackling climate change and working to preserve oceans and forests. So a very broad range of aspirational areas with a sort of 2030 target achievement date, which are really aimed at states. That said, very many companies have now adopted the ESG and aim to integrate them, have adopted the SDGs and aim to integrate them into their business models. Even if the Sustainable Development Goals are intended primarily to be adopted by states, there are increasing numbers of sort of matrices and toolkits to allow the private sector to integrate the SDGs into their behavior and decision making and link up with their ESG strategies. So you often see reference to the SDGs in sustainability reports and indeed in some of the mining initiatives that we'll touch on. There are a few logos here associated with climate change, science-based targets, the logo for the Paris Agreement meeting, and the CDP. Climate change is really front and center of many companies' agendas nowadays. Many companies are adopting science-based targets, so those are emissions reduction targets that are consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement to reduce emissions to a level that's consistent with 1.5 or 2 degrees of global warming. Measurement and disclosure is a really important component of reducing emissions, and that's an area that the CDP initiative has been working on for many years. I haven't put the TCFD logo on here, but the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures is an organization that's got a lot of momentum over the last few years, and it sets out a model for disclosure of carbon emissions, but also a really interesting way of requiring people to model their businesses against particular scenarios to explain how the business will be affected by climate change. And the idea behind that is that it'll make businesses a lot more resilient. There's been a particular push in the financial services industry, particularly for banks, on TCFD, but that's moving more broader across other organizations. Next, ESG ratings. I think it used to be felt that ESG was a fairly amorphous concept that couldn't be quantified, but that's no longer the case. In fact, I think there are many detractors who are of the view that the amount of ESG rating material that's now available is excessive, and it's very difficult for all the ESG information that's available about businesses to be assimilated and meaningfully compared. In any event, ESG and sustainability ratings are very much more a factor in corporate behavior than they used to be, and they're one that's taken account of by a lot of investors. Coming back to investor pressure, the PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment, have been around for a long time nowadays. PRI is the world's leading proponent of responsible investment, and it helps to understand the investment implications of ESG factors and to support the internalization, if you like, of ESG among the signatories that have signed up to the PRI. And there are very many people that have signed up to the PRI, so they're really very mainstream nowadays. And I refer to them really to highlight the increasing investor pressure in respect of taking ESG matters seriously. This is just one example of many, but you'll have seen probably publicity about relatively recent statements made by BlackRock encouraging companies that it invests in to disclose in line with industry-specific sustainability accounting standards boards, SASB guidelines, and also the TCFD's recommendations, which I just touched on. The Equator Principles also have been around for quite some time now. They've been through a number of revisions. They really relate to the financing of project-related activities. They've been adopted by over 100 financial institutions. They lean on the IFC's performance standards, but critical in the mining sector from a financing perspective. Another example of how ESG criteria can be integrated within a business's behavior and are being policed, or are intended to be being policed by the financial institutions which lend to them. Human rights I'll skip over, but I think ESG, you can't really think about it without touching on NGO and civil society pressure. And particularly in this area, there's the Responsible Mining Initiative, which reports regularly on the behavior of entities in the mining sector. We'll touch on some of their sort of recent conclusions, particularly in respect to the mining principles, shortly. Starting then with the International Council on Mining and Metals mining principles. These are relatively recently adopted, and they cover a very broad range of factors under the headings of governance, social and environmental. So ESG in reverse, if you like. Within the environmental category, they include things such as a commitment to ensure the management of environmental impacts, tailings and waste, to manage hazardous substances, a prohibition on the use of mercury, commitments to no net loss of critical habitat and making adequate provision for mine closure. As with many of these ESG initiatives, there's a reporting and assurance framework which requires independent assurance of conformance with the principles. So they're a very good example of the kinds of initiatives we're seeing in this area, but I think these are probably the most recent and the most all-encompassing of ESG initiatives in the mining sector. So moving into a bit more detail on ESG initiatives in the mining area. We'll start with the Responsible Gold Mining Principles. They cover a broad range of factors under the headings of governance, social and environmental matters. Within the environmental category, they include a commitment to ensure management of environmental impacts of tailings and waste and to manage hazardous substances. A commitment to prohibit the use of mercury, a commitment to no net loss of critical habitat, and also a requirement to make adequate provision for mine closure. In terms of the sort of compliance side, there's a reporting and independent assurance of conformance with the principles. which is required, and there's an assurance framework that allows businesses to demonstrate how they're living up to the principles. I won't go into any detail on the Kimberley process because it really looks more on the social side of things, but the process was established to prevent conflict diamonds from entering the mainstream rough diamond market. And Copper Mark contains a risk readiness assessment, which looks at 32 key areas covering a broad range of mining and refining operations. The risk readiness assessment is widely used in the metals value chain, and it condenses over 50 international standards and guidelines into still a broad range of 32 issue areas. And it provides an online platform for companies to complete self-assessments of their performance and provide evidence to substantiate their assessment. So on the environmental side, it covers some of the areas which you'll sort of start to become familiar with you now, such as implementing environmental management systems, quantifying and establishing reduction targets for CO2 disclosure, implementing and quantifying energy efficiency improvements, commitments around biodiversity and those kind of issues. On the assessment side, it's required to have a documented plan with stakeholder inputs that addresses environmental and social aspects and makes financial provisions for closure and reclamation of mines or mining facilities. So overall, I think what you can say about this range of initiatives is that there's a very broad array of soft law principles that require a mix of reporting and review. But it's important not to overlook the implications of hard law. Inadequate as it may be in many circumstances, almost all jurisdictions require a form of permitting and regulation in respect of environmental matters. What can be the case, though, is that local law may not be particularly robust, or legal scrutiny can be scarce, and the policing of the law may not be adequate. So in many ways, a lot of these voluntary initiatives, although they can be seen as not having teeth, they may actually be more effective than some of the hard law alternatives. There's also a lot of commonality between ESG initiatives and not just in the mining space, but in other sectors too. General trends include risk management, the requirement to carry out risk assessments, commitments to improve performance, prohibitions in respect of relatively extreme matters, such as avoiding using particularly hazardous substances, or keeping clear of particularly sensitive receptors. A lot of effort goes into the development and wording of all of these international guidelines. What they do generally shy away from, though, are specific targets. Businesses are required to set their own targets. They're not mandated by these standards. And they don't generally include independent grievance mechanisms on the environmental side, or any sort of form of quasi-legal form of redress. A lot of the sort of enforcement side comes down to reporting and policing by NGOs, civil community, and affected communities. Taking a step away from mining sector-specific initiatives for a moment, another really key driver at the moment in the ESG space is the ability to tap into green, sustainable loans and bonds in particular. This is really an area that has grown exponentially over the last few years. There have been relatively few reported uses of ESG financial products in the mining sector, although getting on for a year ago now, Rusal signed Russia's first sustainability-linked pre-export finance facility and a related syndicated loan. What's really interesting about that is that Rusal was very clear that the interest rate that would be charged would be based upon its achievement of sustainability key performance indicators, which are included in the loan agreement. and those KPIs apparently included Russell's environmental impact and sustainable development. So I think we're likely to see, not just in the mining sector, but in other sensitive sectors too, an increasing use of sustainable finance to allow businesses to adapt to a much more ESG regulated environment.
So as I mentioned earlier, there's a raft of recent EU legislation in the ESG sphere. Not all of it's going to be of direct relevance to the mining sector, but a lot of it's going to at least be indirectly relevant in terms of additional, particularly investor pressure that is going to be created. So starting then with the disclosure regulation, this is a regulation which will impose disclosure and transparency requirements on investment managers, insurance, pension providers, and administrators. And they'll be required to make pre-contractual disclosures to investors about matters like how sustainability risks are integrated into investment decisions. They'll also have to publish certain sustainability and related information on their website, and have to consider how sustainability is incorporated into investment decisions. So that's going to be a significant change or driver of change for entities that are investing in mining companies. Alongside that, we have the low carbon benchmarks regulation, which tackles to some extent the degree of greenwashing in this sector. So the benchmark regulation is intended to require investors or to provide investors with a user-friendly tool for analysing low carbon benchmarks, and it will do this by requiring benchmark administrators to disclose how they measure and reconcile different ESG factors. So again, broad application here and an attempt to improve the standards of ESG information that's out there in terms of matters like ESG ratings. Also importantly, the EU has recently published the taxonomy regulation. It's a strange title, but essentially this is a way of the EU setting down what in its view constitutes an environmentally sustainable economic activity. So creating a bit of consistency in the ESG market. The uses of the taxonomy are potentially extremely broad. Initially, at least, they'll be used in terms of the EU's green bond standard to determine whether or not activities are green enough to fall within the criteria set out in that green bond standard. But there are going to be significant other changes that draw upon the taxonomy. For example, financial market participants and large public interest entities are going to be required to make statements about the extent to which their financial products and activities align with the taxonomy. Draft legislation has also been published, which will have the impact of making certain financial institutions conduct mandatory assessments of their clients' ESG preferences and prepare various reports to clients explaining how recommendations meet ESG preferences and provide information on ESG factors relating to particular financial products before providing investment advice. Those proposals are currently under consultation. Financial services regulation also requires that the European Banking Authority reports on the introduction of criteria on ESG risks. It may be that the authority goes on to impose requirements in respect of taking account of ESG risks in the supervisory review and evaluation process. In the UK, the FCA, Prudential Regulation Authority, and the Bank of England have also made it clear that sustainability and climate change are high on their agendas. For example, the FCA is looking to require certain listed issuers to disclose in line with the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. Taken together, though this legislation or these legislative and regulatory initiatives may not all have a direct effect on the mining industry in the near term, unless, for example, they're a listed issuer that would that's subject to some of the proposals that we've just discussed. I think these initiatives are very likely to significantly indirectly affect the mining sector by cranking up the pressure on investors.
So I think we can see that the EU's position in respect of ESG legislation is really ramping up. Significant changes are being made to the regulatory environment, likely to filter down and affect business behaviour. The UK's position is a little bit difficult to work out at this point in time, with the transition period for leaving the EU and ending very soon, and it not being clear whether or not all of the ESG legislation will be adopted by the UK. The US position does seem to be different. There is significant concern about the requirements of ESG entities that are looking at issuers and subjecting them to scrutiny, and a significant divergence in their approaches, and the lack of consistency in terms of ESG standards that are being promoted in the US. And it remains unclear as to whether or not the SEC will intervene in a way that reflects the EU's increasing legislation, or whether or not it will essentially be left to issuers to continue to determine what is material for businesses in the US in terms of their reporting in particular. Many commentators have raised the prospect of a bit of forum shopping being possible in the future, certainly for large entities, in terms of the requirements that will apply to them in terms of ESG, be that in relation to disclosure or other kind of material hard law requirements to carry out certain activities in accordance with ESG criteria. So what does good ESG practice look like in the mining sector? Well, there's currently no one-size-fits-all solution. When you look at NGO commentary, some of the things that they're really keen on include regular public disclosure and audits of their ESG performance, classification systems in respect of environmental incidents and reporting as much information as possible about incidents that have taken place, annual disclosure of those incidents, a particular focus on the location and construction type of tailings facilities and any particular risks around those. One perceived innovation is linking sustainability-related KPIs to financial compensation of people that work for mining businesses to really integrate ESG into corporate behaviour. Touching again on disclosure, publishing environmental data for companies' mine sites, and requiring the development of biodiversity management plans, for example. I think it's useful to go back to the Responsible Mining Initiative, which we mentioned earlier in terms of NGO pressure. In its 2020 report, it was it's assessed 180 mines in 45 different countries in terms of their disclosure of basic information on some of the principles that are required to be complied with under the mining principles. And it found that a lot of those sites didn't do very well, scored 0 on the basis of some of the indicators that it looked at, particularly reflecting a sort of lack of disclosure on some fairly basic issues. So obviously that's an NGO perspective, but there does seem to be an awful lot of work that can be done in terms of improving ESG performance, particularly on the environmental side, if mining companies want to do so. But I think if we have one sort of overarching conclusion from all of these initiatives that are taking place, and that's that it does seem to be increasingly the case that ESG now offers an opportunity to get a competitive advantage in the mining sector if you're doing it well, if you have the resources to do so and the desire to do so. That's both in terms of risk management and the perception of the extent to which you're managing risk, and also on the financial front, there's been significant evidence that good ESG performers are actually outperforming poor ESG performers from a financial point of view too. So with that, back to you, Ian.
Thank you, Tim. This brings us to the end of this webinar. Thank you all for joining, and thank you in particular to Tim for his very timely and insightful remarks. We hope you found it helpful. Please do get in touch if you have any follow-up queries. If you would like similar information on any other webinar in this series, please let us know by contacting your usual Mayer Brown contacts or emailing our events team at lon-events@mayerbrown.com. Thanks again for listening, and we look forward to you joining our future webinars.